I was an only child. I, of course, turned 18 and registered for the draft. That was about the only way you could join up in those days. I was out of high school 2 weeks when I was called in. I think it was rough on my parents. Everybody had the same thing on their mind, and that was join up with something and get it over with as soon as possible. How could these dirty names bring themselves to do this to us, you know?
Well, I was born in Baltimore City, August 11, 1924. And when I was about 3 years old, my parents moved us into the Govins neighborhood, where I actually grew up. Went to elementary school at Guilford Elementary and high school at Baltimore City College. A mid-year class that I graduated from, that was in February 1943. And by March the 7th, I was in uniform. I had registered for the draft and had a date to report on March the 7th, and met with some other guys at the draft board, and we were bussed down to the 5th Regiment Armory and given an orientation and taken to Fort Meade, where we went through the induction process.
On the morning of the 16th, I was on an outpost guard in this little shelter, sheltered by some logs and trees, when the artillery barrage began. The shells were falling in around us, crashing through the trees and exploding. And I got down as low as I could to the ground. I remember looking up at the sky and seeing it literally covered with airplanes. There were bomber formations going east all morning. There's no figuring that out. I could have been just as easily been killed or taken prisoner as anyone. And you call that fate or the hand of God, whatever.
So during the day of the 18th, we were shuffled around from one village to another, expecting to be attacked, but we were not. The night of the 18th and 19th, we moved farther west, and during the day of the 19th, we came into the vicinity of Manhay, Jubaval, and Barak Fratur. Somebody up the line in higher headquarters must have given Major Parker orders to establish a roadblock at Barak Fratur. So at this time, the only thing left of the regiment was 3 howitzers and about 100 guys out of 500. We went into position there with laying the howitzers down 3 of the 4 roads, and we were further reinforced later the day, the 19th, with a group of men and equipment from the 203 Anti-Aircraft Battalion. They had 4 M14 or M16 half-tracks with quad 50 caliber machine guns on them, which they were in place to defend the crossroads. All of the other GIs that were there were assigned spots in the perimeter to dig foxholes and set up a defense. got a nice letter from General Gavin. He was commander of the 82nd Airborne at the time. He said that he was at the Villages Freight Shore and was going to come over to see what he could do, but the fire was so intense that he turned around and went back the other way. But he wrote a nice letter to Major Parker saying that our guys did well. We destroyed their timetable, which was essential to them. We held them up 4 days. General Manteuffel gave us the credit for destroying their timetable. He said he knew then that their attack would fail. But by destroying the German timetable, they were not able to resupply. They were not able to gain the momentum that they thought they would gain. And that won the battle. So the night of the 19th to 20th was calm. The 20th, the weather was foggy, rainy, a little bit of snow mixed in, and we just further consolidated our position with deeper foxholes. And there was also men from the 87th Recon troop from the 7th Armored Division came across the crossroads, and they joined us in the defense. The Germans apparently were getting close to us, although we didn't have any attacks until the night of the 20th. I was detailed to take over a foxhole on the road to Houffalize, along with another GI. And this foxhole had already been established by somebody else. It was about 300 yards down the road south toward Houffalize, and it was equipped with a telephone. And when we were assigned to go down there, Captain Brown said, you fellas just keep your heads down and keep your eyes open, and if you see something, just get on the phone. So it was about midnight, and the other guy and myself we're sitting there with our eyes and ears on full open, and it was quiet, foggy, could not see very far, very dark, and we heard a strange noise. It was like a swishing sound, and as it got closer, we looked up, and there in the road was about a dozen German soldiers on bicycles. And we had a daisy chain of mines stretched across the road, and that was only about 10 yards away. And when these Germans got to that spot, they stopped, of course, and began discussing what they were going to do, I suppose. We couldn't understand what they were saying, but we knew it wasn't English, and they were wearing square hats, so we knew who they were. I got on the telephone with Captain Brown, and he said, keep your heads down and we'll sweep the road with the quad 50s, and I'll fire my 45 after we're done shooting, and you fellas get out of the hole and get back here quick. Well, that's what happened. We ducked our heads down, and they opened up with these 450 caliber machine guns, and it was a chaotic scene to have these things flying over our head. And when it stopped, the other guy and myself, we jumped out of the hole and ran back to the command post. I'm not saying I ran fast, but I ran out from underneath my helmet. It went rolling on the ground, and I just never stopped to pick it up. I just kept going. And as I got back to where we had a howitzer in position there, I was calling out the password. It was Coleman that night, and the countersign was Burner, Coleman Burner. And I'm hollering, Coleman, Coleman, and somebody took a shot at me. So I used another password, and that password got me past. Anyway, we reported it to the command post, and Captain Brown told him what happened down there. The next morning, Captain Brown picked me. I was a scout, so I guess I was the logical one to go. Later that day, the Germans probed again, and some of our guys took a couple of prisoners. One of them was a German officer, and he had a sergeant with him. And the officer could speak English. Well, they tied him up and put him in a room in the farmhouse there. And for a while, I was detailed to guard them. And the German officer talked to me, and he wanted to know how come we just didn't surrender to him. Why were we putting up a fight? That he said they had such overwhelming odds that they were going to take the crossroads and kill everybody that resisted, and they were going to drive the Americans back into the Channel. Well, that was what he thought. Apparently he'd been brainwashed. Later on that day, those two were put into a Jeep, and they were taken elsewhere. One road was still open, the road to Manhay, and that's where they were taken. About halfway up that road was some of the 7th Armored people, and I suppose they received the prisoners. The 22nd of December was fairly quiet, but the 23rd was another day. The Germans apparently had been resupplied. It became obvious that they didn't have fuel for their armor. Otherwise, they would have attacked sooner, I'm sure. They all day long they kept up fire with mortars and small arms, and it wasn't until late in the afternoon, probably about 4 o'clock, still daylight, that they started with their heavy stuff and started knocking down the buildings. And at one point during that day, 3 tanks were coming up the road, and I thought, well, we've had it. But they were American. Probably just about dark, maybe about 5 o'clock. I was in a building with another soldier, getting warmed up, you might say. We were getting thawed out, and the Germans started to shelling us with heavy stuff, and we were sitting on the floor, and something hit the wall behind us up high, and exploded the wall into the room. It became full of dust and debris, and the other soldier and I, we just decided that we weren't going to wait for another one, and we went out the door. At that time, it was pretty chaotic outside. Didn't seem to be any organization at all either. We got out the front door of this building. It was right close to the road, and ran about 10 feet to the ditch alongside the road, got in there, and there was about a dozen cows in the road. They apparently had belonged to the farmer who had the place, and a couple days before that, to regress a little bit, he had been there to milk the cows. Anyway, he wasn't there then. So we ducked through the cows to the other side of the road, and the fire seemed to be coming from behind us, so we just kept going in that direction, ran down through the field. And I guess we had gone about 50 yards when my buddy went down, and looked like he wasn't getting back up. So I went over to him, and he had been hit by something, and I don't know, I think it was probably a mortar shell that exploded next to him. Anyway, his right side was all disabled. And in the moment it took me to realize what was going on, I looked down through the field and there was 2 GIs coming toward me. So I motioned to them, and between the 3 of us, we got this other guy out of there and down to where this patrol was in the woods where these 2 fellows came from. They happened to be men from the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne. So they had a Jeep down there, and they put my buddy on the Jeep, and he disappeared. I don't know where they took him, but probably to an aid station somewhere, and then from there he went to a field hospital, and later on I became reacquainted with him, found out that he had spent the rest of the time in the hospital in England, and then by the time the war was over, he was ready to be discharged from there, and he came on home. Next time I saw him was in Columbia, South Carolina, 1986, the first reunion I attended. So, back to the Crossroads. I made my escape. I stayed with these guys until the next day, late the next day, when we saw soldiers from other outfits. I always asked them, if they knew where anybody from the 106th Division was, and I kept getting no answers until finally somebody says, yes, there's a group down the road. And when I went down there, I found out there were guys from the 589th who were not at the Crossroads, but had been in another direction at the time. And there was a truck there with our duffel bags in it, and mine was there. I had miracle. Clean socks and underwear. There was not enough of the 589th left to form a unit, so those of us who were there were parceled out into other units. I wound up in the 592nd Field Artillery Battalion, along with a couple other guys, and I don't know where the other ones went, but they disappeared, and I didn't see them until probably after the war when we got together at reunions. One little instance, the lieutenant I was with was carrying a grease gun. It's an M3 submachine gun, which I had never seen before. So it was he, the radio operator, and myself were in the attic of this house, and the lieutenant said, I'm going to go outside, take care of personal business. He says, you guys keep your eyes open. Okay, yes, sir. Well, after he left, I looked at this grease gun, and I picked it up, and I thought, wonder how this thing works. So I cradled it in my arm, and it had a little crank on the side. And I pulled that crank back, and when I let it go, it was spring-loaded, and it said, bang! Fire round right out through the window. I put it down real quick.
not so bad.